Hi, I'm Rich Stoll. Aircraft accidents tend to happen whenever task requirements exceed pilot capabilities. Loss of control in flight, especially while maneuvering, is the top cause of fatal accidents in general aviation. Developing your stick and rudder skills to the point where the mechanics of flying become automatic will give you the confidence to respond correctly to an impending loss of control. But more importantly, better stick and rudder skills will free up additional mental energy that can be used to improve prevention and recognition skills such as threat and error management, aeronautical decision-making, and situational awareness. So please, practice your basic flying skills and be safe.
What we've been doing up till now in this webinar series is talking to the CFIs. You know, we did the compassionate CFI, the secret sauce, as we call it, of empathy and compassion. We talked about the learning zone of trust and honesty, non-distracted. And then we talked about incremental mastery. And all of those are up on the YouTube channel. And you can go to safepilots.org. I kind of hijacked that page and put up all the links since it was pretty dysfunctional anyway. We're working on it, as we say. But very, very happy tonight to have Rich Stoll as a guest. With the last webinar on rudder usage, slip and skid, it became very apparent to me that we really needed to drill down on some of those basics, because one of the questioners was asking about whether he could skid to a landing. And, you know, I said, boy, we really got to think about some basics here. So today we're doing just what Rich said in that video. We're talking about the basics of control. And the focus is going to be on this CFI-PRO syllabus, which I think Nick can put a link in the chat. And I don't think that we'll actually get to the maneuvers. I'm thinking our next webinar, October 27th, I'll actually have some film of performing these maneuvers in a plane, which will be more helpful. But before we would do this in a course, we would provide the groundwork. And as a DPE, when I do testing, I'm always amazed when I ask a question, and I'll just throw one out for you, you know, that I would ask a private pilot. If a plane can stall at any airspeed, right? That's what they tell you in all the books, any airspeed. How come we can mark an airspeed on the ASI that says this is where it will stall? And I'll tell you, I get crickets when I ask that question of a private. Sometimes I get crickets when I ask that of a commercial or a CFI. So tonight we're going to fill in some of those blanks, and we're going to try to show you why it matters. Just to back up with a little history here, both Rich and I learned to fly many, many years ago. For me, it was 50 in North Jersey at an airport called Sussex. I was down at Flanders Valley, and it's kind of ironic that our paths took like two divergent roads. Rich got into being upset, recovery, spin, the spin doctrine. I don't know how many spins he's had, but writing 6 books, expert witness for the NTSB. I went to be a CFI and ran a flight school, and now, you know, I fly jets. So I never turned planes upside down. So I asked him to come in to be sort of the expert behind the scenes if I goof this up. But in basic terms, this was what got us into it, and the slip skid. And what I realized right away is some of our people in the audience are CFIs, some of our people in the audience are student pilots. So if we just launch this poll quick, I want to get a take on who you are out there so we can sort of level up the experience for you and speak to the right level of knowledge. So if you take a moment and just do that poll, we'll see where we are tonight. We sent it out mostly to CFIs this time. About half of you have been slipping, which is great. Okay, and just for you, Rich, if you don't see the poll, we're looking at about half CFIs, half private, third commercial. ATP is very underrepresented. Looks like 2 or 3 DPEs on board. So thank you all for attending. And hopefully we can make this valuable for all of you. This last one was a what you see there, the 2 hands on the yoke. And if you guys attended last time, I think I played the video of this. This was actually on a check ride. I was on a check ride, and this woman, 2 hands on the yoke, very nice fingernails, by the way, paint there. but she was skidding the plane to final. And you could see the balls to the right, the turn coordinators to the left, sure sign to a CFI or a DPE that the next thing is not going to be a good thing. And as we explained in the last webinar, that's a pro spin setup. So the thought in my mind was this woman had 70, 80 hours of preparation for her flight test. And here she was doing it completely wrong. And she was going to fail. She did fail. And she'd probably come back in another hour of training and pass. And there's no way we can fix what was done to her as a student. The things she learned were completely wrong. And, it's very hard to overcome that initial imprint. So what we do at SAFE, we're a not-for-profit, and it's all, I say we don't sell anything. All we do is we give away safety. And we have an app online, Safe Toolkit. We have a webpage, safepilots.org. And I spend a lot of time posting to Instagram if you go to Safe Pilots. So I hope all of you are getting those resources, but we started doing the webinars last spring and we did the CFI side of it. And now it looks like we're transporting it a little more toward pilot information. So the big focus is stick and rudder tonight. And Rich provided this infographic and you'll see it there in the chat. But the important thing is the up top. Nearly 80% of general aviation accidents have at least one skill-based error, with this type being the first causal factor in the accident chain about half the time. In other words, what happens is we all fly in a very small comfort zone. And I think I can pop this up on hop here a little. You see this area here. We call that the comfort zone. And it's, probably from 1G up to maybe 1.5. And Rich can probably, qualify that. But, very seldom in my plane am I going to experience 2Gs. And so this is where we do probably 90% of our flying. Occasionally we'll get outside here into a little more G, maybe a little negative once in a while, and you fear the belt tighten. But we're just happy to be there. And what happens in loss of control is we get forced by weather, by ATC, by something out of that comfort zone, and the pilot startles and they can't control the plane. So what the extended envelope does, and you can see it here, this is just, doing more of the basic maneuvers you're familiar with, adding a few specialty items. And if you look through the syllabus at all, you'll see that it's got turning stalls, ballistic stall recovery, falling leaf, secondary stalls. But my point to pilots is before you go and try to engage in a UPRT course, maybe you want to try that first. When I was a new CFI, what I did very early on was I decided this could be dangerous. And I really want to know what a plane looks like upside down. And I really wanted an upset recovery, but back in the 80s, that'd be the 1980s, they did not have upset prevention and recovery courses. So I went to an aerobatic school and I learned hammerheads and a bunch of stuff, but it really didn't apply to my situation. The one thing I see when I read UPRT literature is fidelity. It has to really speak to what your situation is. And so it occurred to me that it was a bridge too far. I was really trying to get, the wrong thing in the wrong place. And what I did was I engaged this old geezer, and he's a local pilot, or was, he's passed on now. But basically I built a syllabus, which is a lot like what you see in this extended envelope training. It has the things going just a little beyond that comfort zone, pushing it out. So we're doing 60 degrees banks. We're doing falling leafs and secondaries, and it really improves your comfort in those areas. And certainly then it's a segue into a UPRT course once you know how to use the rudder correctly. So, but backing up, this is the NTSB published this for years. It was the loss of control was always on the top of the most wanted list. I think they got tired of putting it up there, but quite frankly, if you look at their webpage, and I pulled this up today, accidents are decreasing, and you could see that coming down. But at the top of the causal factors, loss of control, and the blue one there, the light blue, and I don't know if you can see that, put a pointer up here. arrow right here, this light blue one, that's the fatals. So it's a very disproportionate number of fatals when you look at the rest of these. Very common for it to be a fatal, even though accidents are coming down, loss of control is still a very prominent problem in the industry. And, you know, it's easy to forget when you look at things like this, that someone died, someone didn't go home. As I say, game over, no replay. This is serious stuff. So practicing and working out of that comfort zone is really a critical thing. So the course we're talking about is just this, you know, 2Gs, 3Gs, maybe at the most, and 60 degrees of bank. I guess 2Gs would be about it at 60 degrees of bank. So anyway, I'd like to introduce
Our first panelist will be Rich Stoll.
Our guest here, and this is the NTSB introducing Rich Stoll because he's a expert witness, but his point to the NTSB was, you know, we still have a very big problem in flight training. And I think if you guys are onto the current accelerated flight training, it might not be getting better. It might be getting worse.
Mr. Stoll.
Thank you. The status quo in aviation education is unacceptable. Those of us who provide spin and upset recovery training see the results of our training system on a daily basis. We constantly deal with the same recurring questions and concerns, the same fears and frustrations. Member Wayner has referred to loss of control as a stubbornly recurrent safety challenge. Recurrent indeed.
Our first panelist.
So there you go. I don't know if you can bring Rich up on the screen there, Nick. Yeah, and you can see he's got an upside down plane, of course. So how's everything in Idaho? Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, pleasure to be here, David. And thanks to Nick for manning the controls behind the curtain there. And yeah, everything's going well. It's nice weather here. We've got some fall weather for a change. We're in the 70s instead of the hundreds, so that's a good thing.
So you got that hot weather too.
Sure do.
Anyway, so yeah, so last time we put this up, and you know, there's really, you got to understand where the risks are. And the AOPA study from 2017, geez, I was going to drop that in the chat too this time, but it was in the last webinar. I'll try to find it on one of the breaks here. But 90% of stalls occur on the takeoff and turnout. And we were emphasizing the fact that the use of the rudder is just not part of what people are thinking about. And when you look at that syllabus, the extended envelope, you'll see that the very first thing is talking about canceling yaw. In other words, when you get a new student, this is for your CFIs, on the runway and you apply power and that plane's going to go to the left. Don't stop there, bring the throttle back, do it again, and emphasize the fact that the power is going to pull that plane to the left. The control to use is not the yoke. That's the driving impulse. The control to use is the rudder. So a little poll here, I just want to know from you guys, if you would be gracious, is how long since you did your last power on stall? Because that's exactly what we're talking about here. So I could see the CFIs represented. I did 5 of them today. Okay, good. All right, so I don't know if you're seeing this too, Rich. Rich Leb's data. He's much more the engineer than I am. I see Greek letters, I start to wilt. But I got about a third probably a week ago, a month ago, a year ago. So it's pretty well. And then down the bottom, some honest souls. 11% said, can't remember, it's been so long. So we're talking to the right people. So there you go. And this fact should kind of put a little bit of stiffness into you. I think I can, yeah, there we go. So if I turn this off, and I don't know if I can, you're going to have to bear with me. We go here and switch cameras.
So while you're doing that, David, let me just one clarification about data. I'm a recovering engineer, so let's put it like that.
Okay, I like that. I know when Rich talked to me first about when he learned to fly and all that, he's like, my first job was in the basement in Manhattan doing plans or something. And he's like, this is not at all what I want to do in life. So Anyway, if we take a plane and, this would be lesson 1, 2, 3, and I seem to have lost the elevators somewhere down in the studio here, but we don't need that. We just need rudders at this point. But as soon as you add the power, it's going to pull off to the left. And you're all going to see that as an early CFI. And as a student, that's part of what goes on. What you have to remember is that when that happens, it's yaw. And what we should be correcting for it is with the rudder. And, when I do a DPE, sit out there, take a test, and I'm walking around the plane pre-flighting, I'll ask, what does the rudder do? And I get the craziest answers. There's really not an understanding of what this does. And so you have to start that right away. And the other thing we'll talk about is the whole effect of wind on that tail. So still searching for my lost elevator. Sounds like Jimmy Buffett song. Anyway, nobody likes this. And it is probably the most boring part of any syllabus. And we beat it to death and we use inch moments and we, thousands and this and where's the decimal point go. And after all this laborious, somebody will put a dot on that envelope there and they'll say, we're within the weight and balance envelope. And then the DPE comes along and says, well, what does that mean to you? And you'd be surprised that no one seems to know what that means. Why is there a little box and why is there a big box? So what doesn't get conveyed is where does that box reside in the aircraft silhouette? And if the center of lift is there on the wing, where would you find the center of gravity? Would it be forward of the center of lift? Would it be behind the center of lift? And some people might say, oh, as it adjusts forward and back in the envelope, it might be behind them. But the fact of the matter is that it really is always ahead of the center of lift. And this seems to be lost in all this decimal point chasing and all of that crazy calculation. People miss the big point that the nose is the heavy part. And really, for most stall recovery, if you just unload the plane and let go of the yoke, the nose is going to come down because it's the heavy end. What does the tail do? The tail provides a downlifting force. And this you can illustrate to your students in the first flight lesson. If you add more power, the nose of the plane rises. That's pushing wind over the tail. The tail goes down, the nose goes up. If you reduce that power, it loses that downward force and it goes into a series of phugoid until it stabilizes again at a new airspeed, depending on what your power setting is and where the yoke is. But it's key to everything we are going to do in a plane that you understand that the tail lifts down. The second sort of part of that is this idea that when you add power, you're making more wind over the tail. That affects the elevator. That also affects the rudder. And so, people miss that very important point. I know Rich probably has done more spins than I've done takeoffs. But, the rudder part is huge for any kind of recovery of a spin.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we want to talk about the awareness and prevention sides of it, because obviously if we're relying on the recovery part of it, more often than not, it's going to be too late. But being aware that you virtually can't change any other control in the airplane without needing some kind of an adjustment with the rudder, right? Change the power setting, probably need to adjust the rudder, start rocking the wings with the aileron, got to do something with the rudder. And in some cases, even pitch changes require some change in rudder pressure. So the rudder is indelibly linked to most everything we do with the airplane. And so from an awareness and prevention point of view, if we can cancel the yaw ahead of time, we don't have to worry about using a full opposite rudder to stop a spin, which, I think 90+% of accidental spins occur at or below 1,000 feet, already too late. So we're already in the traffic pattern. Back to you, David.
Yeah, I like that. And the point you made, I think when I was listening last year at Oshkosh, maybe it was you or someone else, every change you make to one control has a secondary and a tertiary level of change. As flight instructors, we tend to just teach, maybe ailerons with rudder, and we forget that pitch is part of it. Everything has got to be meshed together. And the point Rich was making on that infographic up top is we really have to burn these into the student early on. Our learners have to get a feel for the plane, its muscle memory. Because when bad things happen, the cognitive part of it is often, as Ed Wishmeyer says, unavailable. The rudder really has to become habitual and absolutely a best friend of one of these people. So if we take one more point of this and we say, okay, what if the weight moves forward on, CG, if you look at where the strut is and you say you move it up to where that red line just behind the datum, just for argument's sake, no one's going to move the CG that far. What would happen to the stall speed? And this, people, again, that very first question I asked, what happens to stall speed? How can we mark it on a airspeed indicator? We really can't, because as we move the weight forward and back, the stall speed is going to change. So if you just look at this teeter-totter and you say, okay, if I move the CG forward, there's got to be more down tail force. The plane is supporting more weight. The stall speed has got to go up. So as you add weight, stall speed goes up. You can reach that angle of attack at a higher airspeed. It's always going to stall at the same angle of attack, but the speed is going to vary. And that's on one of the 10 questions at the end, by the way. So we do the thump thump. But here's our airspeed indicator, right? And there you go. The government has marked at the bottom of the green and the bottom of the white. There's the stall speed. But does it always stall there? And so we just talked about weight. So let's take that a little bit further here. And let's see if I can get a pointer up here. Pointer. There we go, arrow. There we go. Okay, so here's stall speed. And you can see there's a line up here like this. And there's something called maneuvering speed. And those are integral, they're related. In fact, if you have a normal category plane, 3.8 Gs, the maneuvering speed, if you said it was 4 Gs, is going to be just about double the stalling speed. People cannot relate maneuvering speed to stalling speed. All of these represent G-force, which, if you think about what we were just talking about, is weight. G-force is just more imposed weight on the wing. And so we can bring that stall speed all the way up to maneuvering speed, and that is where we would get the maximum G the plane is rated for before we start to get structural damage. Not the ultimate load, that's 50% higher, but structural damage. And just take a look at your old PA-28 or Cessna 150 sometime and say, how new does this look? It's the Cool Hand Luke. How lucky do you feel? And I know you could talk about this diagram a little, Rich.
Yeah, sure. And it's interesting because as you're showing the accelerated stall line, basically. So for all intents and purposes, let's say it starts at 1G, although there is part of the envelope to the left of that we can talk about from a UPRT or aerobatic standpoint. Maneuvering speed is particularly interesting because we label it as maneuvering speed, but you sort of hinted around as to what it is. What is it really? Asking the audience, and it's not a rhetorical question. What is maneuvering speed? And I'm not asking for the standard FAA definition. Look at the picture. What is maneuvering speed? Well, the answer is it's the design limit stall speed. It is a stall speed, right? If we're at maneuvering speed and we hit 3.8 Gs, however that happens, the airplane will stall before it bends or brakes. And I will surmise that it's easier to recover from a stall than it is to bail out of a broken airplane. So this whole discussion about separating maneuvering speed out from the stall speed discussion is in terms of, well, why does maneuvering speed change with the weight of the airplane? It changes because it's a stall speed, and all stall speeds change as the weight of the airplane changes. It's that simple, but we make it a lot more complicated than it really is. Back to you, David.
Yeah, and what I see on flight tests, is they struggle with the stall speed, and you get maneuvering speed, and you're just sitting there waiting for the light to go on. But it's such an easy. I mean, we're not talking Greek letters. We're not talking complex equations or calculus. This is a very simple, okay, so if you pull hard and you give it 2 Gs, it's going to stall right here. The stall is very much acting as like a fuse, a breaker. It's going to stall before it breaks. And that will happen up to this point. Above that point, we're test pilots, and we're probably going to get some deformation of the airframe. And hopefully all the parts stay attached. But loss of control, very frequently, when you look at the accidents, the plane came apart. You know, somebody was in a spiral dive, they incorrectly responded. And we have to understand that we don't want to pull and bank at the same time. Maneuvering speed is in a single axis, but they frequently pull and bank and the tail comes off. So parts are left all over the desert and the plane ends up in the weeds. So this is not something that we generally are going to demonstrate to students, right? We're not going to take it up, but it's something you could get in UPRT. But how can a CFI kind of bring this understanding to a student? Part of it is just what I did, which is to say the plane supporting more weight, the stall speed goes up. What is G-force? It's just more weight. If you take 3.8 G's, multiply times your max gross, that's what the plane is supporting. And that's a lot of weight. If you think, okay, an old Cessna is going to support 10,000 pounds, you know, that's just aluminum. So, but that's what the certification allows. Anyway, not to beat this into the dirt, but really we have to do a better job in this area. And it's not hard. It's something you could very early on bring to a student and they could build on that knowledge. So I just want to take a moment there. We got any questions coming in there? I've mesmerized you all.
Yeah, so actually 2 of them, and they are both spins related. One is from Terry Pitts asking the question, for a CFI applicant, you know, does it matter if they do their spin training in something like an extra 300 versus airplanes that they're going to actually be training in? It's a good question, but it's the second question that needs to be asked. The first question that needs to be asked is, are flight instructor applicants receiving the depth of knowledge and the depth of spin training that is alluded to in the endorsement in their logbook? And the answer to the first question is no. So it doesn't really, at that point, doesn't really matter what airplane they're in. The other issue is something like a Cessna 172, even though it might be approved for spins in a very limited part of its operating envelope, is actually somewhat, I'll call it spin reluctant. And it can actually create a false sense of an ability of the airplane to spin. And of course, when you're spinning an airplane like a 172, your forward center of gravity, lower weight, you're in the utility part of the envelope. But oftentimes, what happens when the instructor gets out of the airplane? The pilot loads the airplane max gross, 3 of the biggest friends they know, and they try to depart off of a high density altitude airstrip, a totally different kind of an airplane at that point. So much easier to stall spin an airplane with improper control inputs at the aft part of its envelope, approved envelope, as opposed to the spins approved front part. So I would say, first of all, we need to make sure flight instructor applicants are receiving that the endorsement rings true and that they are competent to teach spins, which at this point in my experience is more often not the case. And then it doesn't really matter. I would say you want an airplane that if you command it to spin, it will spin, not 50-50 or 30-70. You want consistency in the spin training environment. Chances are, if you go to something like an extra 300, very high performance, but it behaves in a spin like a decathlon or any of those other classic spin training airplanes. If the question were, if you were going to learn rolling upset recoveries in something like an extra, all you got to do is tap the stick like that and you're upright. So that's maybe not an ideal transference of knowledge to a 172, where if you had a rolling upset, something like a Citabria or decathlon might be a little bit more appropriate. Vince asked the question. He did training in the A7D at 30,000 feet. And of course, an A7 does not have the same mass distribution as most of our light airplanes. He asked, why don't we in general aviation use ailerons with in spin recovery? David held up the whole book, 500 pages, starting with the Wright brothers on stalls. In the light airplane context, ailerons neutral is the best choice, and maybe one or two exceptions out there, but it just has to do with differences in mass distributions and everything else, and also making it easier for the pilot to know where to put the controls for spin recovery. So Jeremy Sederoff asks now, so how do we make sure, how do we close the gap for CFI applicants? And that's the $64,000, maybe with inflation, the $10 million question. I'll let David answer that one.
Oh, no, that's, you saw Doug Stewart's analysis of flight training at AvWeb at Oshkosh, and it was just Niles there interviewed him, and it's just depressing. And what's the answer? And Doug just went, I don't know what the answer is. And at all levels where, we don't know what the answer is. The answer, though, is the people here tonight. People that show up for a seminar like this are obviously interested in expanding their skills, knowledge. And so you guys are the ones who, if you're instructors, can build better instructors. That's the answer. SAFE has a mentoring Facebook page, which Dorothy Schick runs. That's wonderful. That, people are asking and experts are answering and people are developing courses. It's so exciting to see that kind of pursuit of excellence, because what I see as a DPE is 70 on the knowledge test, and the point that Rich was making is all of these will spin differently. I think what I see from applicants is they went out and they did sort of a circus ride. They did the spin, they did it right, they did it left, but they still don't understand what's going on with it. If I went back to this little diagram here, just to illustrate that, if we had a plane and there's the tail, and what I said about the wind on the tail, Rich was the one who really publicized that PARE spin recovery. Why do we get the power out so soon? Well, the power is pushing the tail down. It's making that plane spin flat. It's not going to recover the stall unless the heavy end comes down. So power out brings the nose down and the recovery starts. You have to understand the very basics, or all of this is lost. I mean, if you don't understand this part, the spin part is lost too. Power in and out is a very important motivator of that tail. That's what gives it the force to recover or not. So it's complicated, but it all starts with a very good basic training. And again, if you were in a previous webinar, the 3 hours of training, or 3 weeks of training can get a private pilot. Not so much. I'm not there. Really not enough time to get habits made. Anything else on the spins or questions there, Rich, in the chat?
Yeah, so I think there's a one question from Howard. He's hasn't read the syllabus yet. So Howard, I suggest you go ahead and download that from the link that Nick put up already. What do we do with primary students to train outside of the comfort zone? Part of that, I think, is to start training less specifically to the test. I mean, that would certainly help. And while we were having our practice session, I mentioned to David, you want to talk about getting out of the comfort zone. Why don't we actually train our students per advisory circular 6167 Charlie change 2 is the current one, stall and spin awareness training. It's the required training. And it has a whole lot of different maneuvers that are in there that are very good maneuvers to do with people, so that when they come to UPRT with me, I see Mike Clock is on the call with us here out of Bend, Oregon this evening. We spend half of our time just doing the expanded envelope exercises that people like Ed Wishmeyer, who's on, do, or the extended envelope training that David's talking about, just to get them to the point where we can talk about going upside down in an airplane or doing a spin. So I think there are a lot of things that we can expand on naturally in our training environment, in addition to the things that David's put in the syllabus, but also, looking at AC 6167 Charlie and integrating those elements in. And as a flight instructor, if we're not comfortable doing that, we should find another instructor who is and get comfortable doing it so that we can pass that on to our students. And Charles Brown asked, what airplane do you use for UPRT? There's a whole range of answers to that. I do an emergency maneuver training, which I'm, 1987 before UPRT was a thing. We have a normal category version of it that can be done in normal category aircraft without spinning it or going upside down. You can use Citabrias, you can use Cessna Aerobats, you can use Decathlons, you can use a Zlin 242, you can use the Grobe, some of the aerobatic Grobes, you can use the aerobatic Beechcraft, you can use the Extra 300. So there are a lot of different airplanes that will take you to different levels of UPRT, but at least you can start building the foundations, the knowledge, and everything else. Russ still also asks, Dave made reference to a. So Russ, I don't understand your whole question here, so maybe you want to type that in. I see it. Never mind. Skids and straight and level slips can be performed. Okay, I'll have to come back to that. So David, go ahead. I need to read some of these the questions here. And I think two people have their hands raised, so maybe you or Nick can address those.
Anyway, just while he's working on that, you can see that what's going on here. We have some very, very advanced people, and we have probably some people who are still scratching their heads with the stall and how it changes with CG and weight. But, the point I wanted to make with the airspeed is that when a DPE is asking that question, there should be some response that's sort of salient, and they should understand the concept of weight correlates with the concept of load. That envelope has a load limit. They should know that. And everybody, it's not hard to teach. It's right in the limitations section too. But then if we get into this part here, let's see if this will change. Yeah, here we go. And I'm sort of blocking that. Let me see if I can make myself smaller or get out of the way. As we bank, this is how we're adding load to the wings, right? This is the basic square root function here. What's amazing to me is if I were to ask somebody, 45 degrees of bank, how much load does that add to the wings? And this is one of the questions I have still running up on one of my seminars, and I get answers. And about half the people say, it's got to be at least 2 Gs. It really is only 19% increase, and it's not a scary. 45 degrees is not much at all. What the Ed Wishmeyer and myself in this course, we do what's called 60-90s. We bank 60 degrees, we turn 90 degrees, and we reverse it. And what I used this for initially was when I got instrument students and I was going to start them on commercial. Well, you all know that an instrument student has been droning along for 40, 50 hours, making standard rate turns, very gentle, staying trimmed, everything's there. And the plane, is flying itself under a stable configuration. They haven't banked more than 20 degrees in about a year, or, in an accelerated program it'd be different. But so I would take them out and I'd do 60-90s. We'd do falling leaf. When we do a private pilot applicant in the ACS, it says we can do a 20-degree bank turning stall. Well, and we might as well get into it. And I don't know if this will show up with the silhouetting, but if we take a plane, I try to get the light on it just right. There we go. And it's turning, it's banking. The lift is where? And that's one of the questions in the 10 at the end, is the lift equal on the wings? And always I get somebody that's going to say, oh, the outer wing's going faster. It's got more lift. You need opposite aileron. In a moderate 30-degree bank turn level coordinated, the lift is equal on the wings, or it would still be rolling. It would still be rolling, right? And the ailerons aren't doing anything. The rudder should not be doing anything. Of course, we see pilots that are got all kinds of control pressures cranked in there. The only thing working is the elevator. The elevator is turning the plane. And this is the whole basis of what Rich was, and you could go richstoll.com and see Learn to Turn. But the whole idea is people don't understand what the controls are doing in the turn. And the turn is how they get themselves in trouble because they don't understand the forces. This is Aviation 101. This really should, it's unfortunate that in most of these syllabi, people get rammed into stalls on lesson 3 and they never really learn how to fly a plane. Safe, myself, we're really pushing for lesson 1, 2, lesson 3, 4, 5 should be ground reference maneuvers. There's no reason not to do ground reference maneuvers, climbing, descending, turns before we do stalls. All they're going to do if they get into stalls early is they're going to scare themselves, because they're not coordinated. If they learn to use the rudder correctly, it makes all of that a lot easier. The reason we lose people in training is because they get scared and they drop out and they say, I really just wanted to have fun flying my family to Maine to get lobster. And I didn't want to go up and be an astronaut and do these crazy nose high things. At the right time, it won't be scary, but if we don't bring them in slowly, it will be. If they understand the physics behind it, they're going to be a lot more comfortable. So what happens when somebody gets out of this area and they get up in here or down here? What happens is, probably you've heard the words mentioned, startle. And Ed Wishmeyer's big about cognitive unavailability. Basically, we just panic and the brain shrinks and it's survival mode. And whatever muscle memory you have is what you're going to react with. If you were trained in those areas and trained correctly, hopefully you will react correctly and survive. But in most cases, people panic, they do the wrong thing, they pull when they should unload, and because they see a lot of green, or they add power. My favorite thing when people are doing spins, the nose is down, they add power. I still haven't figured that out, but happens every time. The wrong reaction. So if we're out of the comfort zone, all of this, we're vulnerable, especially here. And as Rich said, less than 1G, is a big mystery area for most people. So you decode any of those questions you want to talk about, Rich?
Yeah, I think we have Nick. Why don't you bring in the hand raisers, and then there's one question from Casey King that we can maybe add after those.
Fantastic. Jim, so I'm asking you to go ahead and unmute.
Sorry, I didn't realize I had a question. So.
Oh, you leaned on the hand up is what happened.
That was an easy one.
I see Brian Lloyd's on board. I think he was doing his spin training in a gypsy moth for a while, and now he's finally got himself a Marchetti.
So Casey King asks, since 89% of the low altitude traffic pattern stalls occur on departure, has there been any effort to emphasize conditions which lend to an aircraft being more susceptible to a departure stall, lower control forces, aft center of gravity? Certainly that could be part of it, but generally speaking, I don't know that they are more susceptible. In fact, if you think about doing power on stalls, departure stalls that you've done as part of check rides or flight reviews, the airplanes are a little bit more difficult to stall because you have airflow over the inner part of the wing, assuming a typical single engine airplane, and over the tail. The real question is, what is the pilot doing, right? So pilot actions have performance consequences. And if we get distracted, if we have some kind of an engine hiccup and we get startled and we start to do other things, where maybe we want to show off, maybe we're subject to a hazardous attitude, which we all are, in front of some friends during the departure phase, and we try to maneuver the airplane when it's not really capable of doing that just yet. All of those things can lead to the departure stall, but ultimately, unless it's an aft center of gravity where it's loaded in such a way that the airplane will stall in the departure phase, even though the pilot hasn't added back pressure, more often than not, it's something that the pilot is doing. In other words, pulling when they shouldn't be, that triggers the stall. David, maybe you have some other insight on that as well.
Yeah, I just I got the silhouette finally off, and I just wanted to make that takeoff as people lift the plane off and they're going. I try to get this right in front of the camera, and it's yawing this way, and they don't have right rudder in there. I think that's a lot of it. Plus, we have some very high-powered planes that people are doing primary training. Tuesday, I have a Cirrus guy that I'm doing a private pilot test in. It's just amazing to me. That's a lot of ponies to control. That's a lot of pressure. And we go, and if you just think about, as this plane turns left, okay, I need right rudder in the left turn here, because it's a stabilized, lifts equal, it's still pulling downhill. If people aren't adding right rudder in that climbing left turn, that plane is skidding. It's pulling downhill. The bottom wing is deaccelerated. If you go to the right, it's similarly, you've got to have a little bit of right rudder, but mostly you need left aileron. So in both cases, You've got controls subtly crossed. You got pressures. And I looked through the handbooks last night. I was desperately looking for some description of this in the basics of the teaching people to fly in the FAA manuals. It had nothing. It really doesn't explain that going left and going right in a climbing turn are completely different. But for those of you that are advanced, your CFIs, you have a commercial, and I think a third of you were commercials. Think about a left chandelle versus a right chandelle. That's a more extreme version of this. And you'll understand, somebody in primary is just confused unless you spend probably 20 minutes explaining how that works. It's always pulling to the left. Climbing to the left, I need right rudder. Climbing this way, it's flying that, and I need left aileron. Right rudder, left aileron. It's like, who would have thought? It's nothing intuitive about that, but it's the very basics. And if people don't understand that, that's why we're getting 90% of these accidents happening on takeoff and turnout. It's to me very obvious that the training is failing, as Rich said in front of the NTSB. Anyway, let's see what else we have on the agenda here.
So David Schulten has a question that goes back to maybe posting the link to your webinar last month on slipping and skidding. He's asking how dangerous is a forward slip to landing in creating a stall condition. And again, a lot of times when we ask questions about these sorts of things, we sort of separate the airplane from us, as if the airplane is doing something to us. It's what we're doing. We do something and the airplane responds, right? So it's not that the forward slip creates a stall condition. It's what we do with our inputs that creates a stall condition. So if you're properly coordinating your aileron and rudder and elevator inputs in a forward slip, you are actually farther away from critical angle of attack than you are approaching critical angle of attack. And perhaps if you can post the link to last month's webinar, that some of that will be a little bit clear. Whereas in the case of a skid, the natural tendency when pilots add rudder, pointing the rudder toward the ground, the nose goes toward the ground. Surprise. When pilots see the nose yawing toward the ground, slicing through the horizon, natural instinct is to pull. Well, guess what our angle of attack is doing as a result of us pulling, as a result of seeing the nose slicing through the horizon? In that particular case, in the skidding case, we will naturally, and in a lot of cases, inadvertently or unknowingly increase the angle of attack. And if we get to critical angle of attack, the airplane can go ahead and depart into a stall spin. But in a properly managed slip, we are actually operating farther away from the critical angle of attack. And here's a very good illustration. I'm going to assume everybody here has seen an air show, and no doubt you've seen a knife edge pass right down the runway, show center, smoke on, lots of noise and everything else. That is the maximum slip you can do in the airplane. Guess what the angle of attack on the wing is in a knife edge slip, knife edge pass? The angle of attack is at the zero lift angle of attack. It's as far away from the critical angle of attack as you can possibly get. So the steeper you make your slip, properly flown, and again, we want to emphasize that, the farther away you get from the critical angle of attack on the main wing, just by way of having to manage what you want the airplane to do in that slip. David?
Anyway, if you take a plane just quickly, and it's turning and you're pulling it out of the turn with the rudder, you've got the forces in opposition. Yaw is going away from the roll. And what I do with students is I put it on a full slip, power back, and I bring it to a stall at a safe altitude. And they're all convinced, they're going to die. But most trainers, if they're not bent or out of rig, they just sit there and the forces are balanced, as Rich says, and the plane just starts to come down at about 700 feet per minute. It's absolutely stable. And it's my way of, showing these people that think, oh, anything cross-controlled, we're going to die. They really have bad information. So if you go to youtube.com/safepilots, that's that webinar's up there, and it's it got about 20,000 hits, pretty quickly. So that will dispel that. But, another individual, and this is what sort of inspired this one, he said, can we skid to land? And absolutely not, because then you're combining roll and yaw in the same direction, and it's pro spin. And that is actually one of the questions in the, if you want the wings credit tonight too. So let's see where we are. Anything else in terms of questions coming up there? Go back to this camera quick and we'll finish.
Yes, I'm just answering a couple that don't need the full
Yeah,
group here,
yeah.
but Phil said he actually still has the original VHS of my emergency maneuver training tape, and I asked him if it's actually still worked. So it's pretty amazing if it still works. And I told him that students have aged me since then. It looks like David Dorn has his hand raised. Maybe we can ask him if he has a question.
No, I didn't. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point here. You know, this is what UPRT and all of this training is trying to combat. When, you know, and every one of us in a plane, if we've flown any amount of time, has at some point scared ourselves, you know, probably slowly in a, you know, back when we had to use charts and actually find the airport, you know, now it's always at the end of the pink line. But once upon a time, we actually had to look around. And I remember not finding it as a student pilot 50 years ago. And, you know, gas is going away. But when it happens, UPRT, you know, when we get forced out of that comfort zone, upside down, sideways, whatever, a wake turbulence, the startle is what's going to take you away. You just stop functioning. And it's not anything you can train away, except by having absolutely ingrained instinctive responses. And that's, you know, if I went back, and I should just play this one more time, if you can spotlight the my screen there for a second, Nick.
You're taking care of David.
Hi, I'm Rich Stoll. Aircraft accidents tend to happen whenever task requirements exceed pilot capabilities. Loss of control in flight, especially while maneuvering, is the top cause of fatal accidents in general aviation. Developing your stick and rudder skills to the point where the mechanics of flying become automatic will give you the confidence to respond correctly to an impending loss of control. But more importantly, better stick and rudder skills will free up additional mental energy that can be used to improve prevention and recognition skills such as threat and error management, aeronautical decision-making, and situational awareness. So please, practice your basic flying skills and be safe.
You know, the point there is how Rich effortlessly did that whole video with one take and just was so eloquent. And no, what it shows is, you know, for somebody like Rich Stoll, there's no unusual attitudes at all. I mean, he's got it locked in. When I went down and flew with Patty, you know, I just have the greatest admiration for that kind of three-dimensional control. But, you know, I spend my hours driving pretty straight and level, and I'm guilty. And I think a lot of us are guilty. And the message of tonight's seminar is that all of us have to keep working on our skills. And it doesn't mean, you know, necessarily going and doing all these maneuvers. It might mean getting a seaplane rating, trying out a glider. All of those things that you do are going to increase your exposure to different attitudes, different control pressures, and make you a better pilot in everything. It really does transfer. At the bottom of this screen, CFI-PRO-wings, if you, and I think Nick has that in the chat, that will take you to 10 questions, which if you answer, will get you wings credit at the master level. And again, I want to thank you all for showing up again. It's great that you've stuck with us. A little bit of dense topic. The QR in the upper left is the next webinar. That's on 27th October. I promise we'll get out and shoot some video of some of these maneuvers. But quite frankly, they're nothing exotic. They really aren't. I mean, we're talking a turning stall. We're talking a secondary stall. The secondary was just put back in the CFI ACS. If you haven't seen that, it's a required maneuver. If the examiner selects it, you have to be able to describe and fly that maneuver, which means everybody training for a CFI should train that proficiency because an examiner could select it. And the reason that the FAA did that, if I were to surmise, is because They want you to demonstrate it. They want people to see that a plane can stall with the nose below the horizon. It's an accelerated stall straight ahead with the nose below the horizon. And I can tell you, it's an eye opener for a lot of people. My students say, oh, I thought it could only stall with, the nose high. And that is the crime of flight training. All the stalls we do are with the nose up in the air. And that's not the one that kills people. It's the stall with the angle of attack is down and they just exceed it with a lot of pull. And since Ed Wishmeyer is on the call, I can always, speak to the audience here, but, angle of attack indicators are great, but, it really is how far that yoke is pulled back. Or the stick is going to tell you what the angle of attack is. What we have to do to recover in just about every case is unload that plane. Remember, the heavy end will come down, the angle of attack will reduce, then roll to the horizon. So I appreciate it. Any more questions quick? You got Rich, who's written 6 or 7 books here to answer them. And I'll play his side.
It feels like not quite that many yet, but I'm working on all of that. Just to kind of piggyback on what you're saying about all of the other different training opportunities that are transferable skills that can come back to normal flying. I hope one of the key takeaways that people will take from this is, you are the consumer. It's your money, it's your time, it's your effort, and it's your life. So be a lot more discerning about who you decide to take instruction from. That's a big key. I hope, David, you'll agree with that.
Oh, absolutely, Rich. As being the director of SAFE, I get calls every day, but one woman in Seattle spent $40,000 to get her private at one of these 141 schools. She had 5 or 6 instructors, and she's no dummy. She's been in tech for 20 years, and she quit that and she got a local instructor, got through her instrument rating in 3 months. And I said, keep going, girl, because, SAFE's going to give scholarships to CFI and you would be my first choice. Very motivated, but she got taken to the cleaners. You really have to be discerning. And unfortunately, in that world of aviation, a lot of people walk in the door and they accept what's given. And right now, the quality isn't there in a lot of cases. So really shop around. And if you're like me and a friend asks, where should I send my son to fly? It's quite a shopping trip to find a good instructor, unfortunately.
But it's worth it.
Time. Thank you all for participating. Shoot that QR. We'll see you on October 27th. And thank you so much to Rich Stoll for having my back on this webinar. Really appreciate it. Once again.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a good night, all.